Hello, I'm Andrea, and I'm delighted to be back at CogX to host this panel. It's a topic I'm particularly interested in because we've spent so much of the last 18 months over at Marie Claire raising an awareness about the significant impact of COVID and months of lockdown, not to mention homeschooling, has had on women's careers and gender equality. According to the UN Women, the pandemic will push 47 million more women and girls below the poverty line, reversing decades of progress. Women were also more likely to lose their jobs in 17 of the 24 richest countries last year. Perhaps most worryingly of all is the fact that only 1 in 8 countries worldwide have measures in place to protect women from the social and economic fallout. Well, I'm really lucky today because I have 2 incredible guests who are going to be discussing the topic with me in a bit more detail and how we go about tackling some of those problems as we find ourselves on this critical sort of point in the journey towards equality. So let's first meet our guests. We have Radhika Chadwick. She's a partner at McKinsey's London office. She leads their technology and innovation agenda across the public sector. Radhika is a career technologist and strategist who spent more than 25 years helping large organizations tackle complex strategic challenges. These days, you might find her helping a government to think through their national AI strategy, handle a major disruption like Brexit or COVID, or working out how to modernize and reform the machinery of state. Or you might find her geeking out on sci-fi with her teenage daughter and worrying about when Skynet will become self-aware. Sophie Walker spent 20 years at Reuters as an international journalist, and after supporting her elder daughter through a diagnosis of autism, campaigned for disability rights. In 2015, she helped form and lead the Women's Equality Party, and a year later ran for London Mayor. In 2017, she stood for election to Westminster, campaigning for investment in care, equal pay, and an end to violence against women. She is also co-founder of Activate, a fund to support women to stand for political office. Her book, 5 Rules for Rebellion, is out now. So I'd like to start with you, Radhika, as your company's done so much research on this topic over the past few months. We all know that women were more likely to be impacted by COVID because of the professions that they work in, like caring and hospitality. And they were also more likely to be impacted by redundancy and furlough. But can you tell us a little bit about how acute the problem actually is from the research that you've done at McKinsey?
Yeah, absolutely. Andrea, this is a massive problem. Our research shows that while women account for 39% of the global workforce, we actually make up 54% of COVID job losses, which means that COVID-19 has made women 1.8 times more vulnerable to job loss than men. And frankly, this is coming after a period where we saw almost no progress in workplace gender equality. Anyway, between 2014 and 2019, we saw overall stagnation in the important numbers around female participation in the labor force. So now with COVID-19, it feels like a double blow. Women are bearing the brunt of the economic impact here. So why is this happening? Our analysis finds that 1/4 of this difference can be explained by the fact that, as you said, men and women tend to cluster in different occupations. Women are disproportionately represented in industries that are hardest hit by COVID, just as you said, like accommodation, food service, hospitality, retail, wholesale trade. But that's only 1/4 of the difference. The other 3/4 of the difference relates to the lack of systemic progress to resolve the societal barriers for women at work, which basically means we're still more vulnerable because there are still gender inequalities. So a key factor here is the burden of unpaid care. Women do an average of 75% of the world's total unpaid care work, which includes childcare, caring for the elderly, cooking, cleaning. And so as COVID-19 hits, it's disproportionately increased the time that women spend on family responsibilities. But it isn't just that. This is actually a lot more about traditional societal mindsets about the role of women. So according to the World Values Survey, more than half the respondents across South Asia and MENA agreed that men have not the same rights as women, but more right to a job when jobs are scarce. And in fact, About 1 in 6 respondents in developing countries said the same thing. So in an emerging economy, where you know that a large share of the women's labor force participation is around micro enterprises, what we're seeing is that when family resources are scarce, like money for investment or even use of digital devices because the kids need them for online schooling, we're finding it's the women who are forced to deprioritize their jobs. And that's flowing through to the numbers that we're seeing on female entrepreneurship. And it's not just emerging economies. Closer to home, we've been talking about a double shift. Women are putting in a full shift at the office or at work, and then again at home. So I hear all the time from female friends and coworkers, they're really struggling. The demands have increased, the support has decreased, and women everywhere are reassessing their priorities. And on a final point, if that wasn't bad enough, looking ahead, we've got another challenge on this front, which is the long-term impact of automation, which is again going to disproportionately impact women. So all in all, it feels like a pretty dismal picture.
Yeah, absolutely. What impact is this gender imbalance having on the economy, though, Radhika? Can you share any insights in terms of what's happening in the UK first, but also globally?
Yeah, I think, any way you look at this, the numbers each where are massive. So we've done some analyses, and in a gender regressive scenario, which is basically where nobody takes any action right now, no action is taken to counteract these effects, we've estimated that global GDP growth could be $1 trillion lower by 2030, right? But that assumes that between now and 2030, women's unemployment simply tracks that of men. So if in fact we see things worsening, we see women leaving the labor market permanently because of increased childcare burdens or attitudinal bias, then the global impact could actually be much more. And then of course, linked to that, as you know, is a whole host of knock-on factors where, in times of economic stress, we tend to see gender-based violence in many countries increase. We're already seeing that. We see disproportionately higher dropout rates for girls. So it becomes a spiral, an economic spiral that gets very, very tough to get out of. On the flip side, the good news, though, is if we take action now and we don't wait until the crisis has subsided, we estimate we could add $13 trillion to global GDP in 2030, compared with that first gender regressive scenario. So it's a huge threat, but also perhaps an even bigger opportunity to make a system-wide shift.
Sophie, having worked in politics, do you think there's a wider discussion to be had here about representation in Parliament? Because a lot of the policies that were made by leaders at the height of the pandemic, and to some extent since, have not really been reflective of the whole nation, have they?
No, I think for workplace policies that see and respond to women's needs, economic policies, social policies, we need women policymakers. And I think that has been made abundantly clear by the government's reaction to the pandemic in this country and in other countries. And what we have seen very interestingly, that female leaders in some countries have done much better at grappling with the impact of COVID, because they have been much more balanced in terms of working out which parts of the population are most affected and how. Radhika has given a superb summary of the impacts that we've seen. I mean, just here in the UK, we know that we've seen the dire collapse of the childcare sector, 2,000 providers closing in the first 4 months of the year, and a third of maintained nursery schools struggling. We know that the school closures have affected women in particular, and that mothers on the lowest incomes are 8 times more at risk of losing their jobs. It's generally clear to pretty much anyone who wants to look and hear that during the pandemic, women have done more paid work on the front line of the crisis as healthcare workers, as social workers, and more unpaid work in unseen back rooms. They've lost incomes, they're in financial turmoil, and these are for reasons that are absolutely in particular to their sex. Now, on the flip side, we had a Queen's speech at the start of this parliamentary session that made no mention of childcare, no mention of social care, and no support for workers most vulnerable to a jobs market in free fall. The women disproportionately likely to be employed in retail service sectors that have taken such a hit, and also much more likely to be in part-time, 0 hours contract work that's not covered by furlough schemes. Now, I think it's really not hard to see why this has happened. We've had an analysis of the 73 government meetings held in 2020 on the COVID crisis. only 13 of them made any reference to gender, and then only in the context of biological sex that was directly linked to the impacts, the healthcare risks of, for example, COVID to pregnant women, or discussions about why more men were dying. So I think the answer to how we fix this very much is in elections. And you'll have seen in the local elections we've just had, only a third of local candidates were women. Less than 1 in 4 police and crime commission candidates in England and Wales were women. Only 1 in 4 mayoral candidates were women. The less our politicians look like us, the less likely they are to act in our interests. And frankly, the more at risk our democracy becomes. And what I think we really need to push for now is working class women in particular, disabled women, women of colour in particular, all of whom are even less likely to be seen and heard in political spaces, even less likely to have power or influence over the policies and initiatives that are supposed to help them. They need to be supported. We need to support them, listen to them, and we need to put money into it. If I may just briefly say, the average cost of parliamentary candidates in the UK is £11,000, and it's much higher if you're fighting a marginal seat. And if you multiply that by the fact that we found women who take on average 3 times as long to get elected as their male peers, you're looking at a massive cost beyond many in the demographic that need to get elected if we are to change things.
So, I mean, in terms of the network that you deal with through Activate, what kind of experiences are you hearing, and what opportunities do you think have been missed to tackle the problems that women and minorities have faced over the past year?
Well, Activate is a fund that we set up to support women from minoritized communities to stand for political office. And it's been a particularly difficult period because, of course, the elections were postponed for an additional year. We know that women are already greeted by suspicion by many voters whose perfect candidate is male, white, middle class and non-disabled. Men generally also don't get asked who's going to look after their children if they get elected. Women are more likely to struggle to cover childcare costs and the general cost of stepping out of work if they're indeed in paid work to run for office. I mean, it's a huge question in terms of the opportunities that were missed during the pandemic. I think you only need to look at the data and the news stories to see that pretty much every opportunity that could have been missed was missed. As I've just said, there were no women on the government planning committees. So some really basic stuff like testing the vaccine on pregnant women, reviewing it for risk to women taking the pill, to a furlough scheme that didn't cover those most in need of support, to the lack of an equivalent plan for the childcare sector, the fact the government suspended pay gap reporting at a point when it was needed. We've not ever provided PPE in women's sizes. There was no planning around school closures for the impact on women. We also didn't shore up the foundations of our society and our economy that were already in crisis, that would be further eroded by the pandemic. So I think what a lot of the women I've spoken to about is childcare and social care. And special educational needs support. Social care is facing a $7 billion shortfall. SEN services is facing a funding collapse. The NHS is looking at £8 billion, pounds, not dollars. Women's specialist services are absolutely on their knees while also trying to support survivors of domestic abuse and rape that has gone, rates of which have soared during the pandemic. That includes migrant women who currently have no recourse at all to public funds. Local councils are also on their knees. They're passing on the cuts from a decade of austerity to frontline services. I mean, what else? The 2-child limit on welfare payments, the freeze on housing benefits, the impact of foreign aid cuts on the most vulnerable women and girls around the world, just as they're most in need, while finding $37 billion for test and trace. There is not one aspect of this pandemic that would not be improved by having more women involved.
Radhika, from a business point of view, what do you think companies can do to help matters and redress the balance? Do you think that, technology probably has quite a big part to play?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Technology, I think, gives us an opportunity, but also a threat. The opportunity is that, post-pandemic, 20 to 25% of our global workforce could be moving to remote working. That's 3 to 4 times the level pre-pandemic. And it was an existing trend that was vastly accelerated by the pandemic. So hybrid working is here to stay, and anything that helps people work more flexibly, people who have care needs, it disproportionately are women. So when an organization normalizes remote working and hybrid working, you help women. The threat, of course, is that but we still have a digital divide. So globally, women have 20% less access to the internet than men. So what is it that companies can do? I think every industry is different, but that shouldn't be an excuse. That we've got masses of research for years and years that shows that there are 6 areas where every company needs really good metrics to understand their own gender dynamics and to do something about it. So it's recruitment, it's retention, it's advancement, it's representation, it's compensation, and it's inclusion. So the first practical thing that a company should do is in each of these areas, track the data, track the evidence, do it well, do it in real time. You need transparency in where the problems are coming. Are job losses or requests for leave higher among certain kinds of women? Why? Have the promotion rates of women slowed? Why? Are new hires maintaining the gender balance you had pre-COVID? And if not, then also, frankly, was your pre-COVID gender balance good enough? I think the second point really is when you have the data, you can identify the problems, then take action fast. So if your data says that women need flexible working, put it in place now. If they're saying they're struggling without the right technology at home, sort it out. If you're not getting enough qualified women into your recruitment pipeline, and I've seen companies double the fee to the headhunters for any woman recruited, and you know what, fixes the problem pretty fast. So the leadership that's needed here isn't about knowing what needs to be done. It's just about unlocking that internal bureaucracy that prevents you putting some brave organizational policies in place that really make a difference. And then the third thing I would say on a very practical level is visibly show your leadership. Your business leaders have to normalize that we have to talk about what's not working. And we have to normalize the expectation that these issues, when they're identified, will be addressed. So take concrete action, set clear, ambitious targets, build a structured inclusion program at every level of the organization, right? And insist that your supply chain, your community, everyone you work with does the same. I'd like to see companies dropping suppliers because their stance on gender equality isn't good enough.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's worth saying, though, that following months of lockdown, we are already seeing companies sort of pushing employees back into the old framework of the office in the 9 to 5, which isn't always, the most conducive to women fulfilling their potential. Sophie, what do you think that businesses can do to build back better, as it were? And maybe it could be time to redefine our whole concept of the idea of work. What do you think they can do, Sophie?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think we need a work rebellion. I think now is the time for women in particular, but everybody who will benefit from this, which in short is everybody, to really move away from these very traditional sort of white male capitalist templates to much more community cooperative work in the way that we have figured out how to work and support each other, but with adequate support around it. The CEO of WeWork was quoted recently as saying the way for employers to spot their most engaged employees was they're the ones who want to come back to the office because they're the least engaged are the ones who are most comfortable working from home. Now, obviously, this is somebody who's desperately trying to sell office space, but it's also an absolute kick in the teeth to everyone who's been effectively living at work for the last year. I mean, what does comfortable mean? Does it mean most able to work in an environment that enables them to do the childcare and the domestic labour that they are simultaneously expected to do by government and society, and yes, businesses that don't offer shared parental leave or flexible working? The Chancellor said it's important to get back to the office and a culture of riffing off each other. I mean, this is the person whose big plan for tackling the pain of the service industry was to get on a Zoom call with a celebrity chef. I have a real concern that the return to the office for those who are able will be the start of a twin track approach for men and women, and really risk embedding that boys club presenteeism that we know is damaging to women's jobs and careers, and is actually also really damaging to business profits, because endless reports, including an excellent McKinsey one, prove that diverse boards and staff make for better profits. So yeah, I think a work rebellion, collective community groups are key, trade unions, organise, and businesses need to understand that if they want to flourish, they need to adapt. I think those who are privileged enough to be able to step off the wheel are stepping off the wheel post-pandemic. I think those who are privileged enough to be able to think, do you know what, I don't want to have to go back to working like that, are not going to go back to working like that. And so there's the risk of a loss of talent from that side, but also really a loss of talent and perspective and input from people who simply can't access work because they don't fit the mold.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that it's interesting that you spoke so much about, shared leave and men, because I do think, men are often left out of these conversations, and they do have such a huge role to play both in the workplace and at home. How do you think they can be better allies to women? And that's really a question for both of you. Radhika, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, right? Because, I mean, we talk about women, but it's such a broad church. I mean, that's a very, very large group of things embedded in that word. We're hearing anecdotally and through a lot of our surveys that a lot of men have seen the benefits of a reduced commute and more personal time, or time with family, or time to be flexible and care for loved ones or pursue other hobbies. So what I'm hoping is that this feeds into our business practices in a way that, again, normalizes options like flexible working. Anecdotally, we're also hearing stories of men and children having a newfound appreciation for family as a unit or as a team. And, children learning life skills like doing the laundry or helping out at home, men picking up, household tasks that they wouldn't have done otherwise. And also just men opening their eyes to the gender disparity. So, there are quite a number of conversations I've had, anecdotally with colleagues where, a husband and wife, for example, might work at home in very similar jobs, and they notice how much more time the woman ends up having to spend, how much more relaxed the hours are of the man, or the easy pace of his day, and, and the wage disparity as well. So I think the key really here is we've got some new information. We've got some new lived experience. And, what I'd like to see is men using this information to actually demand a bit of a change, to stand up for equality in the workplace. Because this is, in a way, a lived experience you might not have had 3 years ago.
Sophie, did you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I have to say, I don't really buy the argument that men get left out of this conversation. I mean, men are more likely to be leading organizations. They are more likely to be represented politically. If they wanted to do something about this, they absolutely could have done by now. They have more power than women. So, I mean, let's be frank. If you want to be an ally, if you want to change the system, then do something about it. This is not about a talking shop once a year on International Women's Day. You can make the changes now. You can campaign for equal pay in your workplace. You can tell everyone what you're paid. You can leave early several times a week to pick up your kids. You can take parental leave and ask for longer. You can hire women, promote women, listen to women. You could deal with sexual harassment at work. And half of women say they've experienced it. Imagine trying to ask for a promotion or a pay rise from someone who says they'll fire you if you don't have sex with them. I think there's also a vast amount that men, as well as women, can help agitate for in terms of government actions, political actions. Social care does not need badges and clapping. It needs hard investment. Economics is not about hard hats and construction sites. We need feminist economics that will invest in social care and healthcare. We need to understand more widely the factors affecting women's financial inequality, such as the impact of violence against women and girls. We need to address rape culture in schools and universities, which is hurting girls' capacity to learn and be free in the world of education. I think, we need to understand the inequalities of the way careers are presented to boys and girls. We want boys and girls to be equally excited by care and construction and the arts and technology. I think all of these things are things that men can absolutely make a change in. In fact, they probably have more power right now. We know they have more power right now than women. Flexible leave is a day one right. Make that happen in your workplace. Equally shared and funded parental leave. There's a whole ton of stuff. It requires action. It requires listening.
Radhika, anything else that you'd like to share on that?
Yeah, well, I would agree that we've been talking about gender parity for a long time, right? I mean, it's a complex problem. And I think to solve a complex problem, you need all parts of society to step up together, much like we're trying to mobilize the private sector and the third sector and NGOs and government departments all together on climate change. I feel like we need to do that in a much bigger way on the gender issue. And so I think what would inspire me is if I saw business and political leaders working together to take something bold. I mean, do something bold, take some bold action that signals a genuine desire to move the needle. A giant package of tax and structural incentives and support structures to help women join and stay in the workforce if they want to. A huge effort in some way by business to drive home the idea in every country that they have an operation in that, having more women at work means benefits for the whole society. So I'd like to see just us, doing something more and doing it together.
Yeah. I'm going to wrap up because we need to leave a bit of time for questions. But I wondered if anyone would like to share anything in the chat, whether there is anything that they'd like to aim to either Sophie or to Radhika. We had one come through. What role does education play in closing the gender gap? I don't know if either of you would like to take that one.
I think, when we set up the Women's Equality Party, equality in education was one of our 6 core goals. It is absolutely vital. I think that an education system in which boys and girls understand they are equal, from a tiny age is incredibly important in a world that currently teaches boys and girls from a tiny age that they are unequal. And I think another key part of this in schools is not just the point I made earlier about encouraging boys into caring professions and girls into tech professions as professions for everybody. I think right now there's a slight attempt when we talk about getting girls into tech as sort of crowbarring them into a sector for men. So I think we really have to completely stand back and open everything out. But I think there's a key point about education, which is educating boys and girls that gender equality is essential and a human right. And that goes absolutely to the heart of the other points we've all made here today about ending violence against women and girls as a really important step towards all of the other work that we have to do.
Yeah. Another question, how has COVID and lockdown impacted your own experiences as a mother, both guests? Anyone want to take that one?
Yeah, should I jump in?
Yeah, jump in.
In all honesty, it's been hard. It's been really, really difficult. As much as you think you have you have your life all together, when you've got something like a global pandemic, which throws everything up in the air, it is actually really difficult. And I find myself really more and more aware of the intersectionality of who I am. So, we know that as a working mothers, have 40% of working mothers and about 27% of fathers are now spending at least 3 hours a day more than they did pre-COVID-19 to meet household responsibilities. And I feel that very much in my day-to-day life. Again, senior women are also impacted, and there's a whole set of impacts that regardless of whether or not you're a parent, senior women have been impacted. And then minority women or Black women or BME women have been impacted. And in a way, you sort of, I think it's quite intriguing to, on one hand, be studying about the effects, and on the other hand, be actually seeing them play out in your own home and your own family, and feeling the tiredness and just realizing that there's something that you're a statistic, and it's actually quite difficult, I think, to reconcile what we know needs to be done with being able to do it when everything is against you in so many ways, when you've got sort of all the support structures that you're relied on. Dog walkers or somebody coming in to help with cleaning or shopping or not being able to get your groceries, all going away, but the demand's increasing. So I have to say, my personal experience as a working mom is it's been actually quite difficult. And I guess that's why I'm quite passionate about this, because if I just sort of play that out, 8 billion times, 6 billion times, that's what's happening worldwide. Mm. So it's an enormously difficult thing. I'm afraid I don't have any personal answers on how you manage this as a working mom. You sort of muddle your way through.
Yeah, I mean, is there any good news to be had? We're sort of talking here about some of the bleaker aspects for women and gender equality. Does anyone want to sort of chip in with anything that they've, that they feel is, something positive to have come out of it, and perhaps the opportunities that we have now to address that balance?
Yeah, I'd like to say something. I think I remember when I was leading the Women's Equality Party and President Trump was elected, and it felt absolutely awful. And actually, there was a flip side to that, which was that it galvanized a lot of people, and it galvanized a lot of women and a lot of feminists. And there were a lot of protests. There was a lot of organizing. You know, on the one hand, there was a man who was effectively saying, "Hey, look, now you can vote for, you know, misogyny and sexism and racism." But what it did was galvanize action against it. I think what the pandemic has done is absolutely lay bare the impact of our sex on women's experiences of life, and also the multiple intersecting discriminations that, layered with sexual inequality, create even deeper unfairness. So Black, Asian, minority ethnic women, disabled women, women from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. I think we can be absolutely unapologetic about campaigning for and organising for and insisting on policy making by women for women. You know, my whole activist career, I've always had people say to me, "But what about this and what about that?" And my answer has always been, I'm here for the women unapologetically. I think the answer is in women's equality, and I think what this last year has shown absolutely is an absolute key focus, because if you can't design for the furthest first, then you're not designing for everyone.
And if I can add, you know, I completely agree with that. You know, we do have, I think, a once in a lifetime opportunity to reimagine and reset how we work in a way that could bring lots of capable, qualified women back into work, because we've removed the barriers that stopped them before. So, you know, I guess the flip side of a global situation that we're all going through together is that, you know, everybody, regardless of gender, regardless of what you said, are reevaluating how you spend your time, what you spend your time on, and what's worth it, and you know, where does family play into this, and where does care, you know, where does travel play into this? So just that opportunity to rethink, I think, is one we shouldn't lose, because you know, it's only when you have everybody going through a shared experience like this that you've got sort of the beginning of an impetus to drive some change that everybody will buy into.
Yeah, totally agree. I remember hearing very, very early on in the pandemic, and I think it might even be sort of March 2020, so really at the very beginning, hearing, I think it was Charles Moore on Radio 4 saying, already arguing then that we shouldn't let this like change normal life too much, and saying, you know, this is an emergency, it's not normal life, or something like that, he said. And I think what's been revealed is that normal life is an emergency for many, many people. It really is. And I think we have to be really, really careful and conscientious and organized to make sure that understanding is maintained in the face of multiple efforts to get us to go back to offices and eat sandwiches and sushi from corporate outlets.
Well, and on that point, I think we'll wrap up. Thank you so much to the panel today, and to everybody who joined us. Enjoy the rest of CogX. And if you want some key takeouts from some of the brilliant stuff that the panel said today, we'll be doing a full write-up over on marieclaire.co.uk later. Thank you, guys.